please.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this latest edition of Breaking Down Barriers. I'm Jenna Heilman, Executive Director of HDYO, and we're excited to bring a really important and especially timely topic today, where we're going to be talking about the complexities of the regulatory world. We've had some news recently within the HD space about regulatory conversations, and it's always something that we need additional education on because it's extremely complicated. So I'm excited to have Henk alongside me today to help bring his expertise. So Henk Schuring, welcome, and do you mind introducing yourself?
Thank you, Jenna. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak about regulatory affairs, and that will show probably later in the questions and the answers. I'm a pharmacist by training, and I'm currently working as Chief Regulatory and Commercialization Officer at Prilenia. And I've been working in this regulatory affairs field for about 30 years now, both in Europe, US, as well as in many of the other countries in support of seeking approval for drugs or medicinal products, as some call them, across the world.
Can you mention, Henk, a little bit of the other disease areas that you've supported in those roles?
I've been working in lysosomal storage diseases. I've been working in oncology, in neurology, especially in the field of MS, multiple sclerosis, I should say. Working in oncology, transplantation, but almost all of this has been in the field in the last years of rare diseases or first treatments. So while I started my career in a company like Baxter, anything for hospitals and blood banks, lots of dossiers to submit. I moved in 99 to Genzyme and then moved into the rare diseases, and especially in the field of diseases where there are currently no treatments, as that is a slightly more difficult area to be than if you are in a product that is in an area where already approved therapies exist.
Yeah, and I should mention that while you're with Prilenia right now, this is a general conversation about how regulatory affairs works for rare disease overall, and then specifically with rare disease communities, with that wealth of knowledge of different companies that you worked for and different communities at risk and how you've championed for them. So I think it's going to be a really important conversation. So I wonder if you could, let's kind of reset. Can you describe what a regulatory body is and what its purpose is?
It's a great question. As anybody of you will probably has had a medication at some time prescribed by a physician. That could have been for an illness like a cough, could have been for a pneumonia, could have been for bronchitis, whatever. Whenever a doctor prescribes a medicine, if you look at that medicine, and let me talk about it for the US at this moment, you will find on the label that it says an NDC code. And that NDC code means that it has been approved by the FDA in this case for the US, and the FDA looks at every drug or medicinal product to ensure that it meets the right quality criteria, so it's of a good quality, that it is safe and efficacious. And if it doesn't meet those three criteria, the product will not get approval. So what the FDA really does is ensure, and every regulatory body, ensure that medicinal products are of the right quality, are considered to be safe or acceptable safety, because no drug has no side effects in general, and has shown that it is efficacious for the disease or indication, as they put it on the label, that it is intended for.
So it's kind of that extra checks and balances to make sure that because sometimes I think that people feel better when they're taking medications, but maybe it's not great for the whole. So even if there are some populations who maybe feel the benefits, but overall it could be complicated and potentially harmful, then they have to make a tough decision when it comes to those types of things too.
Correct. So if they look at, for example, efficacy, they will look at whether the clinical studies have been conducted in patients of the right design, and often what they will look at from a design perspective, the control arm, whether that was a placebo or something else, and whether the endpoints, and especially the primary endpoint, is one that is clinical meaningful for the disease and clinical relevant. So if you look at huntingtons disease, if you go back to the Voice of Patients in 2015, patients really clarified that cognition and function were important. And if you look at those, that immediately translate to, for example, endpoints in the form of total functional capacity or Stroop word reading or the signal digital modality test, SDMT in Huntington.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration in the US. A lot of times people focus on that, but are there other regulatory bodies throughout the world, and how do those kind of function in similar ways?
So in principle, every country has, in essence, their own agency that looks at these elements. In Europe, every country has their agency. In Japan, we have the PDMA. Europe is unique in one other way, as you have the European Union. So while each of the member states have their own agency, they also have an agency that is overarching for the European Union, which is called the CHMP, where they work together. Something similar also occurs in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries, and the GCC countries, for example, also work together on this aspect to assess dossiers and whether medicinal products are adequate in quality, safety, and efficacy.
Mm-hmm. You said CHMP. Is that similar to the EMA?
Oh, it's a great question. So the EMA is the European Medicines Agency, is an administrative body. The CHMP is the Committee of Human Medicinal Products and is set up by the European Commission to provide a scientific opinion on whether a product is of the right quality or has adequate safety and is efficacious. Why is that set up in Europe in that way? Where FDA can decide on this and provide a legal opinion, the CHMP cannot provide a legal opinion. The European Commission is the one that in the end gives the legal opinion, and they need a scientific advisory board, which is the CHMP. And they are supported by the EMA as an administrative body. So
yeah,
you often see that those two are.
At all.
It's very complicated, but that's why you often hear about EMA and CHMP in almost in the same way. But technically it is the CHMP that is the equivalent of FDA.
And so if a therapy, let's pick on Europe right now and stay here. So if a therapy is approved by CHMP and EMA, using them kind of together, does that automatically make it approved in every single country within the EU?
So if the CHMP approves it, it will be approved in the EU, plus Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein. They adopt that. But that doesn't mean the same as that it is immediately available. Only in Germany where you can launch immediately, but most of the other countries have a market access process, as we call it, of a health technology, where you have to discuss the value and the potential price of the product before you can launch it and before it can become available to patients.
Yeah, I think that's really important because and we'll get a little bit more into that, but I think it's important to understand that designation because it is really challenging, and it's frustrating to the community if something gets approved to be like, why can't I access it today? And we'll talk a little bit about that complication too. One of the comments we got, I think it was when we were releasing news about Skyhawk and their plans. One of the comments we got on social media was, how can this be approved in Australia when it hasn't been approved? I'm just going to say that. Basically, how can the clinical trial run and potentially be approved in Australia without them running a trial in the US first? So I think that there's this idea that it has to be clinical trial has to be run in the US regardless, and it has to be approved by the FDA first before it can move into other countries, which is not true. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about that?
So you can basically go to any country where you can do the clinical trials. There is no required preference of where to go first. Many companies, because the US is a huge potential market, will go to FDA first, but there's no need. Sometimes you can do your first studies easier in another country. Australia, for example, in the last years has become a country where a lot of first-in-patient studies have been started or first-in-human studies. And that's what happened with Skyhawk. And they apparently had discussions with the Australian authorities on the design of those trials and potential pathways to an approval. There's nothing against that. I do want to add that if you look at FDA website, you can see that Skyhawk did submit an investigational new drug application as well in the US. So FDA is aware of the study and what is going on.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, so that goes into our next question too about the process that industry partners, pharmaceutical partners have to go through with this regulatory communication. But going back to why certain countries are picked, if a country is picked over another country, is that because there are less rules that they have to follow, or is there just more opportunities for communication, higher access to the patient population who may be eligible to participate? What are some of those like deeper criteria that make more countries appealing over others for partners?
It's a great question, and it is, I think, in many ways product specific, sometimes disease specific, sometimes dependent on top physicians or top researchers on where to do it. It may even be dependent on where the company is located or has good connections. Mm-hmm. It all depends in many ways on what you want to do in your first study. We have seen in many rare disease patients that FDA in the last years has always wanted placebo-controlled trials from the beginning. In some cases in Europe and in Australia, that was possible to not do that, which is a huge benefit for patients and for the community. But if you can't do that in the US and you can do it in another region, sometimes it's a good reason to do it because clinical trials are costly. If you have to do a placebo control and you do one-to-one, that would mean that you have to double the number of patients that you need for the trial versus if you don't need the placebo. So it's often that type of reasons. Also, costs of clinical trials. For every patient in the trial, the costs that a site has to make, that a company has to make, are quite high. And sometimes a study can be cheaper if you do it in Australia than in the US or in other places. And sometimes it works the other way around. And sometimes, as I mentioned, you can have the top researchers in the field that are located in a certain country that you really want to have involved. And then you go to that. Mm-hmm. The key is always that certainly in rare diseases, when there is no treatment available, most companies will go early to the regulatory authorities to discuss their plans, their ideas, their potential clinical studies at a very early stage to get buy-in.
So does that early stage include after animal testing, which typically it comes in? Is it even before that they have that conversation with the regulatory affairs?
Some can do before. Some will go before animal studies because they want to have certain feedback on which animal studies to do. Yeah? For example, sometimes you are asked to do a carcinogenicity animal study. That is a study that takes about 2 years of treatment, very long, very costly. If you can have a discussion with the authorities that you can do it in another way and shorten that, it will shorten your non-clinical, your animal safety development, and shorten your total development. Because let's add this to the discussion here. Typically, it takes about 7 to 10 years for a medicinal product to get from the discovery to potential approval state. And only 3 on 1,000 make it to an approval state. So that tells you a little bit on how challenging this is. Mm-hmm. So that's why in this highly regulated area, many companies will go early. Another part of that discussion is that sometimes you're obliged to go early. Like in Europe, if you have an orphan designated product and any product that you want to seek approval for, you will have to submit for a pediatric investigation plan. And typically they want to see that at the stage that you have what they call PK data, pharmacokinetic data. So that explains how the drug is after you take it, how it is absorbed, how it is moved to the right places in the body, and how it is excreted. Once you have that type of data, they want you to discuss potential implications for pediatric patients as well.
You mentioned orphan designation. We've heard that a few times in the past couple of years for different companies and therapies receiving that. Can you share a little bit more about what that means?
Orphan designation is basically a reflection that it is a rare disease for which currently no treatment exists. In the US, that is defined as less than 200,000 patients. In Europe, it is defined as a prevalence of less than 5 per 10,000 and a disease for which currently no treatment exists, or if you have a significant benefit versus that treatment that exists.
Mm-hmm.
So the criteria per country can differ a bit, but Huntington disease, ALS, all fall under the rare diseases and can request orphan designation. And the benefit of orphan designation is that it allows you for more interactions as well as potential benefits.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about preclinical work and how you engage with the regulatory bodies early in order to get buy-in, and that kind of sets the stage for the next series of conversations. So when a company goes in and has a design for a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 study, how does that communication typically work with the regulatory bodies?
So you can request meetings with the authorities. Some of these meetings can be virtual, some can be face-to-face, or in person, as I would call it. Others can be written responses. With FDA, you can talk about, for example, type C meetings. With the European authorities, you talk about scientific advice, which you can do with CHMP or on the national level. All countries have these type of, and what you typically do is you say, we are planning to do a study. Then you explain which population, what type of endpoints, duration, what you would like to see as outcomes, and what you are trying to achieve. And then you ask, do you agree with the patient selection for this study? So, which is the eligibility criteria? For example, patients with a confirmed diagnosis of Huntington disease. They are in early manifest, for example, or prodromal, whatever population you want to go. Then you discuss the endpoints as well as the ranking of the endpoints, because you will have to decide what is your first or primary analysis and what is your secondary analysis, and because that will determine whether your study is successful or not. The primary analysis is the first one. If you meet that one, you have a successful study. If you don't meet it, you will have a study that failed the primary endpoint. Doesn't mean that you cannot show positive effects on secondary endpoints, but you have in principle a study that missed a primary endpoint.
That's, I think, such a sticking point for the community, which gets really frustrating, is you have to, at the very beginning, set goals in place, which is really set to expedite evidence, scientific evidence of efficacy and safety. But that makes the process longer, because if your secondary endpoint or some of your other endpoints show benefit, but your primary fails, then you have to kind of go back to the drawing board and do additional studies or additional work, not necessarily having to go back to a phase 1 if you're in a phase 2 or phase 3, depending on what that looks like. But you do have to do another clinical trial in most cases. Is that a fair assessment?
That is often the case, and it's even more difficult in diseases where currently is no treatment, because then it's the endpoints are not necessarily always understood, always clear, and sometimes more subjective. And you see that, for example, I'll give an example of a lysosomal storage disease. We did this in a population that was it's in Pompe disease. It's slowly progressive. You have an infantile onset very early with a very clear endpoint, because most of these babies would die within 2 years if they are not treated. But if you go to adults, it's very heterogeneous. It's more subjective, and the endpoints that we were basically forced to use were things like a 6-minute walk test. So patients were asked to walk for 6 minutes, or a forced vital capacity as a lung function. In that study, we showed a statistical significant difference between placebo and the treated patients. But in the end, the difference was like 5% between 3 to 5% between the groups. And then the question came, is that clinical meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have an enormous amount of discussions, because if you look to, for example, asthma, there they would look at a difference of 15% as clinical meaningful. But in a disease like Pompe, where patients continuously lose their respiratory function, any change could be meaningful. And that is, I think, the other part to keep in mind. The population you select for a study is extremely important to allow you within the duration of a study to show an effect. And that means that we sometimes have to be very strict on the inclusion criteria and cannot enroll everybody, how much we would like that. As in the end, what we want to do as an industry is to develop a product and to show the efficacy that the regulators want to see to get it approved, and then get it available to all patients that need it.
And when you do that, so let's say you have a phase 3 trial in a very specific community that's approved, do you have to go back and do additional studies before it's released to, let's say in Huntington's disease, if you're in that kind of early stage of showing symptoms, but measurable symptoms that still are able to be detected with the outcome measurement tools that we have today. And let's say that the therapy is approved, could you then automatically go into someone who's more symptomatic, who's maybe more progressed, then could participate in that trial, or even earlier? Or do you have to then prove that it works, and what time is best in additional studies?
So over the last 30 years, I've seen both scenarios. Yeah. And let's give a scenario where, take ALS, for example. In ALS, you have seen that companies often take a very specific population of early rapid progressive, and then it is approved for the wider population so that everybody can get access. I've also seen situations where it was approved for, let's say, the later population, but then the companies had to commit to doing additional studies for earlier prodromal populations, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think what we hear from the community, especially the later stages, feel ignored because they can't always participate in clinical trials, and there's a big, completely understandable concern of what's too late for them, and so I think that's just always in the back of our minds. If a therapy is treated, is how to best support those communities and make sure that the therapy, if it's showing efficacy and safety in earlier progression, that they can access that if they choose to.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's say, we recently had, so we've kind of talked about preclinical in the middle of being in a clinical trial, and the FDA or the regulatory body approves things like how many participants, what the mechanism, dosing, all of that. It also includes things like whether or not to have a placebo, using natural history data, things like that. And we just went through something where, can a regulatory body change their mind after a clinical trial is done, based off of design concerns? Is that something that has happened before, what we've experienced?
It's a great question, and I have to first say I'm not privy to the details, because
Absolutely, and we don't know that. It's just more in general, not necessarily specific, because it's happened in different disease areas as well, not just with Huntington's disease.
Yeah, but it's the question is always, what type of agreement do you have? Generally, in many of these cases, what I have seen in the past is that there is a kind of support, and they will say, but then they will always have a statement at the end, but it will depend on review during an NDA submission, a BLA submission, or an MAA, because it goes about the totality of data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know, and again, we just experienced this specifically with our disease area. It's happened to others too recently. And Henk does not know any of those details and hasn't been a part of those conversations, but I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up because it is top of mind for the community right now.
It is top, but these interactions with agencies are extremely important. It's also extremely important to read and understand them very well. And they are challenging every now and then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So if a therapy is approved, let's use the example for the FDA, does that mean that the EMA is automatically going to approve it? Or Australia is automatically going to approve it? Yeah, not that simple.
I wish the world was that simple that if you would get it approved in either the US or in Europe or maybe in Japan, that it would automatically go to other countries. Unfortunately not. You will see that many countries like FDA will be very clear that they will say we are responsible for the US and we make our own decision. Mm-hmm. Having said that, politically, they will not like the idea that they would have a different opinion on the same drug between US and Europe, but it can occur. And there have been examples of that in the past. So they try to handle that. One way that this has been handled is that there has been international harmonization on a lot of guidelines that are used in quality development, non-clinical planning, as well as in the clinical studies. So for some diseases like ALS, you have, for example, a clinical development guideline of what companies need to follow. That's one way. Typically, however, you will also see that some of the smaller countries know that they don't have the resources and the time to do everything themselves, and they will generally accept a European or a US approval to follow through and make their process easier. They will still give you a national license, though. So there's some kind of mutual recognition in that scenario.
So it's possible to use data from a different country to go through the approval process. Okay.
Yeah, that is absolutely possible. In that case, and I'm just going to put it back to your Skyhawk example, you can, for example, even do studies outside the US, and that's called overseas data in the guideline, and still get it approved in the US, as long as you can show that the population in which it was studied is reflective of the US population.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And also, this is something that we talk a lot about in our conversations personally, but then across the board too, is how to diversify between countries and between the patient community on clinical trials. Because if every company is going in the same countries for the same target population in a rare disease, at some point you're going to hit oversaturation and not be able to successfully recruit. Plus, you just have different populations of people with different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different experiences. And it's important to have that diversity to really capture the community. So it makes sense on those two fronts as well to, again, as quickly as possible, as safely as possible, figure out what therapies do what they need to do to support the HD community or any community.
Agreed, but add to that the complexity that is coming with certain endpoints. In Huntington, for example, we use a lot of rating scales. They are a bit more subjective, and they will have in different countries maybe different interpretations. And think as simple as a question: can you cook a dinner? In some countries, take Brazil, many people will have maids or other support to do that. So they may give a different answer than in the US on that question. So those things need to be kept in mind as well when you do studies.
Absolutely. Which makes sense. You need to make it appropriate based off of lifestyle and norms within each of those countries, especially when it comes to quality of life or capability type conversations.
And in slowly progressive diseases like Huntington, many of the lysosomal, the other thing to keep in mind, when people commit to be participating in a study, their whole family is involved. The caregivers are supporting and are impacted by that. And it's generally not for short. Most of these studies are easily a year placebo-controlled or longer with the extensions. And this is not like a blood pressure drug where you have maybe 3 to 6 months type of studies. This is a long-term commitment for families and patients in such a study.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think too, it draws back to our specific audience of people who are either pre-symptomatic, prodromal, early stages, about the importance of participating in observational studies for those specific assessments and biomarkers, because we don't currently have biomarkers that are accepted or used for earlier progression of the disease that are widely adopted. And by participating in those observational studies like HD Young Adult Study in the UK, Enroll HD, especially coming up with some changes and new things that they're looking at, that really matters, so we can develop better measuring tools to be able to do clinical trials and understand the progression of this disease, because as we know, it is a long, slow progression, and typically the measuring tools that are used don't capture those nuances and often are focused on the first onset of movement symptoms. And so it's important to understand some of those sensitive changes that happen over that course of time. So participating in any observational studies is incredibly, incredibly important.
It is incredibly important because it can also help, I hope, in the future, maybe in reducing the duration of studies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I'll give you an example where it really helped. In Pompe disease, I talked about the infantile onset before.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was at Gensem and we were developing myozyme for Pompe disease, we knew that survival would be a very strong endpoint that would be acceptable. So what did we do? We went to about, I think, 60 to 70 hospitals, collected the medical records of about 370 patients. And then from that 370 almost, we took those that were meeting the inclusion criteria of our trial. And we were able to show that in our study, 100% survived when 90% of the equivalent patients would have died. That is a case where we were able to use the natural history comparator data
Mm-hmm.
in support of an initial approval of a product. Endpoints are, of course, different, and some of these are much more open to be accepted by authorities. Survival is very simple, very straightforward, very strong clinical evidence. In kidney diseases, you will see time to dialysis in that way. But that is why these data are important and can be used. Personally, I am hopeful that at some point we could get in a situation that if you have a baseline of a patient and you know the slope of progression of a disease before they get on treatment, and you can show after being on treatment in a shorter study that they show a different slope of progression, that would be something to consider for the future. So getting these type of historical data is very important, but it also requires some kind of quality around it. So
Mm-hmm.
if you do annual tests, then don't do it do it in 9 months and then 15 months. Try to be every 12 months within a certain window, so that you mirror it a bit more like how it would be done in the clinical trial, because that will
Mm-hmm.
help using it as a matching cohort.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to draw the comparison between different diseases, because in ALS, it is a very rapid disease, or motor neuron disease is very rapid. So you have to do things quickly, because the harsh reality is that the disease progresses, then you lose patients, to your point of survivorship. Versus Huntington's disease, the progression is slow and takes a course of several years and decades to be able to progress. And so it's frustrating for the community because the trials are so much longer. But then if you could find these biomarkers, to the point of this conversation, then it could shrink that down to something that's much more manageable before any kind of progression might happen, even slowly over that time.
True. I think there's also room in the future for some of these digital health technologies in that way that could help. But then again, they have to be done in the right way. That doesn't necessarily mean what I say, that it should be done with a sensor like your telephone or whatever. Yeah. But if you look at speech on what is, for example, happening there, and I like speech in many ways, but you can use speech by going to the hospital, You speak a certain sentence in a certain way, and then they can, through machine learning, estimate the intelligibility, as they call it. And that has been validated by using speech pathologists. And a speech pathologist is, of course, a clinical endpoint that is accepted. So if you do it in that way, you can also get data that are still clinical meaningful, because many Huntington patients have speech problems. In ALS, that happens in other diseases, neuromuscular as well as neurodegenerative. And it would probably be a faster and more objective way of looking at some of the disease parameters that could help as well. And I think that for me personally, that would be an area for the future to think about: speech, motor function, function instead of using a total functional capacity. Could we develop a digital health technology tool in that way?
Yeah, and I think it's important too to mention the juvenile HD population and how that plays into all of this, because we haven't really seen a therapy-based clinical trial in juvenile HD, which is a travesty and frustrating to everybody impacted. And things like we're getting ready. We've just submitted ethics for our second stage of our joint HD registry, which is trying to capture some of that natural history information and progression as far as um, onset of symptoms, diagnosis, misdiagnosis, symptoms that, the ability to track symptoms that are also important to the families. To this point of how we're measuring things, there are oftentimes symptoms that aren't clinically measured or considered important, but they impact a family's quality of life. Things that take kids out of school, things that take kids out of being able to participate in activities. And so these registries are extremely important because we can partner with different industry partners who are interested in investing in pediatrics and juvenile HD to be able to understand some of these cadences to try and expedite research in juvenile HD. To your point, speech is a huge thing for JHD families as well.
And I want to stress the point that you just made about getting those type of symptoms that they see known. I'll tell you a story, and we're talking about a product for a disease called mucopolysaccharidosis 1, or MPS 1.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a rare disease. And around 2003, we were working on seeking approval together with BioMarin for this globally, and Genzyme worked on this in Europe. We went to the European authority, CHMP, for an oral explanation, which is like a panel meeting. We got questions from CHMP members on the efficacy of the product, and we had endpoints that I mentioned earlier: 6-minute walk test, forced vital capacity. So the physician who had been leading the study made his story about, yeah, we met the primary endpoint and this and this and this, and then the CHMP member said, no, that's not what I mean. How do you know that it worked? What did you see in your patients, or what did you hear? The doctor waited a moment and then said, let me tell you a story. He said, about midway, slightly past midway during the study, one of my patients came to me and said, doctor, I'm on the product and it works. And the doctor said, I don't even know whether you're on the product or not, because this is a double-blind study. So how do you know? Oh, he said, I know it works, and I'm very happy with it. So he probed a bit further and said, so why are you so sure? He said, doctor, you know that this disease impacts the joints in my elbows, my shoulders, my fingers. And for the first time in years, I can now stand in front of the mirror and comb my own hair. My reaction at that moment was, shit, I wish I had known this before, because this could have been a fantastic patient-reported outcome or a quality of life assessment that we could have measured and would have been very beneficial. But it also shows that sometimes we think we know a lot of the disease, but we do not. So these type of things can be incredibly important in understanding if something may work or not, or what to assess.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, there's so many, known symptoms, but the families experience something completely different. So I got chills whenever you shared that story, because it's just those little things matter so much. And yeah, that's a great story. That's an important story to keep echoing. I know we're running close to time, but I want to chat a little bit about how does the community's voice get raised throughout these different conversations?
So in all countries, you will see that there are multiple stakeholders involved in this process and in the approval. Patients are in Europe, US, Japan, many of these countries, one of the important stakeholders. Patient organizations can reach out to the authorities and ask for meetings to discuss what they feel, where they discuss that they feel there's an urgent need to get treatments and what is important to them, and explain to them, to the authorities, what the daily impact of a disease is and how important it is that things are moving forward. And patient organizations should use that voice. That's in some countries they can also use that as part of the health technology assessment process that I mentioned earlier. Especially in Europe, where during that process patients have a voice as well, and they can talk about the patient-reported outcomes. I personally feel very strongly that certainly in rare diseases when there are no treatments, the voice of the patients is even more important to make regulators understand what the daily impact is. We talk about rare diseases. Worldwide, we still think that there are about 5,000 to 7,000, and maybe for 5% there are treatments. That means there's an enormous amount of work to still do. Many of these diseases are unknown. A doctor once told me that for some of these rare diseases, it's 30 minutes in their whole study to become a doctor. Well, if it is 30 minutes for a doctor and they say maybe one or two patients in their whole career with a rare disease, with that rare disease, how do you think regulators that have to look at all these products think about it? So there is a huge need to educate them. And that is not only, I think, the industry that should do that and doctors that should do. I think there's a major role for patient organizations to explain the disease, the impact it has, and a sense of urgency.
I think going back again, one of those, there's the two pieces of it. There's the in-person or anecdotal stories of how it's impacted, but then there's the data that we need to back it up. And these regulatory agencies like to look up both. You need to have large numbers of how it impacts on top of personal stories. And that's where surveys come in to really play. And I think that there's such a thing as survey fatigue, and we all feel it. But those surveys always serve a purpose because we're trying to prove something. We're trying to get large numbers. And if you've ever been to an HDYO event in the past couple of years, you've heard me say, till I'm blue in the face, we need big numbers to make big change happen. And that's why those surveys matter, because look, we can say these demographics in this country, based off of how they are self-identifying in the community, feel like this. And so then we could either go back and ask more questions, or we share that with everybody, as do all of the surveys out there, in order for us to do better, to take it to the FDA or the EMA, or to use it as a way that I have conversations with Henk where I'm like, look, Henk, here's the information. This is what you need to show everybody at your company to better understand what's going on. And so those are really important. So please don't just shake off the survey. If you see it out there, please complete it, because it really does matter.
It does matter, and it is important. And the last thing to add, in the US, when there is a panel meeting, patients can have their voice. They can speak. The patient organizations can speak. In Europe, that may not be in the same way, but patients are a participant, for example, in what I mentioned earlier, oral explanations, or in scientific advice working group meetings, where patients are asked for their opinion on design of studies, whether they feel placebo duration is long or too long, how long they feel would be good. All those things, patients have a voice. And I think the more patient organizations can be involved and have the data to support what they want, the stronger that voice can become.
I think what's interesting is we did, so I'm participating with Dr. Hugh Ricards in the HEATED program, which is looking at trying to gain access to therapies, globally. And so we did a survey quickly, just a poll quickly in WhatsApp with our ambassadors about different regulatory access conversations. we asked who do they think are leading these conversations, and overwhelmingly 99% said HD organizations. And sometimes we're not allowed to. And that's where our advocacy has to come into play to say, companies, you need us. We need to be a part of the conversation, being active in those conversations, because we represent and know which community members would be good to represent the different pieces that are being discussed. And sometimes we're not. And that was really an important point for me to say. It's an expectation from the families out there that we're involved in those conversations.
It's actually very interesting that that expectation is so high. Mm-hmm. It puts a lot of pressure on the patient organizations to get involved in that. I think the other thing that I would want to add there, if I look to some of the new proposals in some of the countries, especially Europe at the moment, the role of the patient and the voice of the patient seems to become a bit more limited. And I think patient organizations should step up big time on trying to avoid that, because for me personally, if you want to develop a product in rare diseases, it has to have the right quality, safety, and efficacy for the regulators. It needs to be something that physicians understand and how to use it and why they want to use it. But also it needs to be something that patients and caregivers understand and want to use. Because if we can't make it understandable for all stakeholders, what are we doing?
Yep, absolutely. No, I think that that's really important across the board. Why build something if it's not useful or beneficial for as many people as possible? It seems like a very easy thing to understand sometimes. Before we wrap up, I want to say a few things. So this is a lot of conversation. This is a very in-depth conversation over a very complicated topic, but only done within, an hour or so. There are a lot of resources out there where you can find more information. So first of all, we have a Breaking Down Barrier animated video that goes through clinical trial and drug development. That's really important because it shows the different phases, how it works, getting into the regulatory bodies and things like that. So that's a really great pace to, again, kind of get the whole scope of what that process looks like. The other thing is that Henk, Peter McColgan from Roche, Astrid Arneson from EHA, and Lauren Holder, who's a US community member, we led a conversation at our HDYO Congress last March that's on our YouTube as well under the Congress playlist that talks about some of the challenges and ways of working together between regulatory bodies, industry partners, and then the community and advocacy groups too, which I think was a really great conversation of trying to bring all of this together with the different players. Henk also came on and did a talk with us about early access programs and compassionate use. That's on our Breaking Down Barriers. And we have our research terminology that is on our website that talks through things like what is an endpoint, the different kinds of endpoints, different approval regulatory definitions that you have, what are some of the outcome measurements, all of that good stuff. So I think that as you're going through, there are a lot of tools and resources out there available for you to either get a refresher or just learn more. Before we wrap up, Henk, any last words that you'd like to say to the community?
My last words for the community would be to first say, as we are in around December 12th, so happy holidays to all. Thank you for your continued support in the Huntington disease space, and keep up the voice. Keep up talking, because there is an urgent need for treatments to start treating Huntington disease.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Henk, and thank you all for watching. And as always, please don't hesitate to reach out to your local national association or to HDYO. We're all here to help in any way we can. Thank you so much and take care.